A mathematician who makes pictures to try to understand hockey. He lives in Halifax and is employed by the public, who subscribes to his brightly colored website, hockeyviz.com. Make sure you get your Patreon subscription. He's also employed intermittently by St. Mary's University, where he teaches undergrads, and by NHL teams who pay him extra to lie about what he does for them in the speaker bio.
All right, thank you very much. So first and foremost, I can't believe that I'm the first person to think about this. I mean, we have the technology. There's really no reason not to do this. So I'd like to thank the organizers, for letting me speak for such a long amount of time. They will discover the error of their ways in due course. So what I'm going to talk to you about is about threat. And what do I mean by threat? We will see. So here's the introduction. That's the whole introduction. Numbers are boring. Pictures are awesome. If there's anything like a manifesto, there it is. In fact, this has come up a number of times. Numbers are what I went into math to avoid, and I have to say it works. Pictures, on the other hand, I'm extremely fond of pictures. So let's have an example of what I mean in the hockey context of getting away from numbers and getting towards pictures. So here is an extremely ordinary fact about the Sedins. Vancouver, this year, with the Sedins, at 5-on-5, generate 45 unblocked shots per hour, both Sedins together, and that's about 5% more than league average. So it's an extremely ordinary factual statement. I actually compiled that 2 weeks ago, and it happens to be still true, which is extremely convenient for me. League average is about 43. This stat is actually slightly surprising. There are only 3 Sedins who, sorry, there's only 3. I know something you don't know. There are only 3 Vancouver skaters who individually generate more than league average. That would be, and the third one is a door prize, which is not a non-existent thing, which I will tell you about later. We can guess in the questions after who the third one is. So that's great. That's a perfectly ordinary fact. It even has a little bit of context in it. 5% more than league average, about 43 shots. It's funny, 5% more, you think that's good. 5%, that's great. You know, that's like a good interest rate. If you say, well, at 5-on-5 they generate 45 shots, but league average is about 42, 43, closer to 43, all of a sudden it doesn't sound nearly as impressive. Still 5%. Numbers are weird this way. So, hello? There's a picture of the shots that they generate, of the unblocked shots that they generate. It says 552 minutes because that's how many minutes they had played together when I made this chart. These days they've played since then. They do that, they keep on playing. And now they're up to 700 minutes, or just short of 700 5-on-5 minutes between them. And, but that's the pattern that you get, and now all of a sudden you realize that, sure, a little bit more than league average is good. Red in this context means more than league average, blue means less, and the darker the more in either direction, as you would expect. And so you see that a big chunk of those extra shots that they're taking are coming from glorious scoring locations. Right in front of the net, extending all the way through the slot, and a good chunk of the left face-off circle. That's where the most of the shots come from, with a little bit of spots from the left and right point, and a little bit on the left half wall, and very, very little from the right-hand side. I wonder which wing Daniel Sedin play. No prizes for that one. So that's, and in some sense, of course, you might say, but Micah, it's not really a picture. It is really a picture. But you might say, it's still just full of numbers. Of course it's full of numbers. It's thousands and thousands of numbers. That's already come up. In fact, once you have lots and lots of numbers, then you can start to draw pictures. A single number is really boring. So what am I going to try to do? What is the point of the talk? The point of the talk is to try to isolate individual skater impacts on shots, both for and against. And I should say here, when I say shots here, so I subscribe to the theory that a number of other people have, I dare to call them acolytes, have come along with that you should say shots on goal. If you mean shots on goal, you should say shots if you just mean shots. And you should say unblocked shots if you mean shots that aren't blocked. And so in this talk, I'm going to be sloppy and not do that. All of the shots in this talk are unblocked shots. So what people call Fenwicks sometimes, just to keep things straight. And the point is to try to isolate individual skater impacts on shots, on shot rates, at 5-on-5, including where they come from, both for and against. We're going to try and do this as symmetrically as possible. All right, next, please. And I could get out, but what would the fun be there? So the idea, the new technical idea is, let's actually take those shot maps and treat them as first-class objects. Instead of treating rates as first-class objects, we're going to take the shot maps themselves and treat them as the things that we study. So, and when we say we want to isolate individual player impacts, what do we want to isolate from? Well, we want to isolate from the aspects of play that are not in the player's control. Some parts of what happens on the ice are in the player's control. I mean, they're grown-ups. But not exclusively. In particular, what things are outside of their control. And so these are the 4 things that come up most commonly in people's wish lists. Number 1, the line mates. You know, whoever it is you got to go out and play with, those are your guys. And maybe they're great, maybe they're bad. But that's nothing to do with you. You just got to do as best you can. Maybe you get put out in the defensive zone. Maybe you get put out in the offensive zone. Maybe you only get put out on the fly. Nothing you can do about that either. When your name comes up, you go out and you play. Yeah, it's a funny thought, you know, somebody just gets tapped on the shoulder and says, no, I'm good, I'll play later. You know, it's like when it's your turn to go, you go. The score is another thing, and this is a little bit more surprising. If you're losing, so this is something that players have an oblique impact over. After all, I mean, the players collectively are responsible for scoring. But if it's your shift to go and your team is already losing, that may or may not have anything to do with you. And even if it was your fault before, that doesn't affect your later shift. You still just have to play your shift. And if you're winning, that's one thing. And if you're losing, that's another thing. And in fact, precisely why the score has such a large impact on the way people play is not completely clear. The precise mechanisms of that elude us. And I've been trying for essentially my entire hockey career, so 6 years now, to failing at trying to find out precisely why that happens. But how it happens and what score effects are reasonably easy, as we'll see. And then the 4th thing that we'd like to get a hold of is the competition you face. If you're supposed to go out there against Datsuk, that's one thing. If you're supposed to go out there against a different player, that's another thing. And again, you as a player have very, very little to do with that. When your shift comes up, you just got to play. Unfortunately, this talk, so we're going to take care of those first 3 things, I think, I hope. You can decide if I've succeeded. I have succeeded. But the 4th thing I didn't even try. I mean, I have to tell you, I have made a shtick out of telling people things that are not the case for years now. You know, this is about zone starts, they don't matter. This is about ice position, it doesn't matter. This is about these, it also doesn't matter. This talk is entirely about something which does matter. I'm going to make a new stat with a fancy name, and I'm going to tell it to you, and it's going to be excellent. And not putting too fine a point on it is my best work, so I hope you like it. So, the first thing we're going to attack is teammates. We intuitively expect that teammates have the largest impact on your individual results than any of those other things that I talked about. And so we're going to, the largest part of the framework, we're going to tackle the teammates first. And the tool we're going to use is regression. And this may bore some of you, and I don't care. But I'm going to explain a little bit. It turns out to be important for technical reasons that you'll see. I'm going to explain a little bit of how least squares regressions works. So the idea is, you begin with a collection of observations. This is just measuring everything that happens. So in our case, the collections of observations are going to be what happened when these 5 people were on the ice, what happened when these 5 people were on the ice, what happened when these 5 people were on the ice. And so already we can work this into our framework. We'd like those observations to be those heat maps, like the ones I showed you for the 2 cities. That was just 2 players at a time. Of course, you have to be careful when you say things like that. It's not 2 players at a time, it's 5 players at a time. It's 5 on 5. It's 2 selected players and then 3 other players who vary through the rest of the Canucks roster. The idea behind least squares regression is that you assume, and this is the part where you introduce your own agency as an analyst, you assume that you can take that collection of observations and you can factor it in the way indicated in the equation. It's a pretty simple equation. However, we cheated. We invented all this technology so that we could make an incredible complexity look really, really simple. So what we're imagining we could get out, what we hope to get, is this beta, this list of imagined individual impacts. So it's a matrix. It's a column matrix. It's however many skaters long as you're interested in, and it's 1 wide. And so each beta, so you have beta sub Sedin Henrik, beta sub Sedin Daniel, beta sub Sutter, beta sub, et cetera, and you hope that what you get out when you're done is a thing that says this is so-and-so's individual impact. That's not what you put in, though. What you put in is these alphas, which say, when these people are on the ice, this is what happened. When those people were on the ice, this is what happened. So the types of the things that you're putting in appear different at first, and the way you get between them, and this is really where you put your stamp on it, is you say, I think that the way that those individual skater isolated impacts, once I've got them, supposing I had them, the way that I would combine them would be like this in the matrix X. And so the matrix X is normally extremely simple. You have some sort of encoding on it. And in this case, what we're going to do is going to encode, well, the precise encoding actually will delay for just a minute. Turns out the trouble with that first equation, though, is that you can't solve it, ever. In fact, the cases where you can literally solve it are basically don't ever happen. And the part of why they don't happen is because all the shapes are all wrong. So alpha, even if we just restrict ourselves to the combinations we see, you have one entry for every combination of 5 guys that you see on the ice. So that's how many different combinations of 5 play in a given hockey team in a given season. The answer is 1,000. Not too many thousand, actually, just a few thousand is typical. Which is surprising, because then the total number of possible combinations of 5 players is way, way larger. On the other hand, how big is beta? It's 1 for every player. So how many skaters actually play for a given hockey team? And now we're talking about tens, 20, 30, 35 if you have a terrible injury-racked season. So in particular, that means that that matrix X, if it has to go between those two things, is not square. It's not invertible in general. And there's generally, because alpha is so much bigger in size than beta, even if you happen to be extremely fortunate, you would not expect actual betas that did that thing. And so instead, you say, well, let's change the problem mathematically to make it one that we can solve. And so what if we multiply both sides by the transpose of X? That would make the shapes line up. Now, in particular, X transpose times X, that's a square matrix. And now you could maybe solve that. You could just take that inverse. If that matrix happened to be invertible, it almost always is. If you just inverted it, then you would get this beta. And you might say, well, there's beta. How's that for a solution? It's not a solution to the original problem, but in some sense, it's mathematically best. We're going to talk about how it's mathematically best. However, part of what makes the whole machinery good is the sense in which it's mathematically best. The reason why it says least squares, regression at the top, the regression is the jargon word. Least squares is the word which is extremely ordinary. That beta is the best possible beta among all the betas that don't work, right? None of them work. There aren't any solutions to the top equation. So among all the things that don't work, that beta, according to that formula, is the best one in the sense that if you measure all of the distances from the betas that you get out, from the notionally best ones, and you take all of the squares of all of those distances, you get the smallest possible answer. So we have some mathematically coherent, although n-dimensional, we're trying to think about massive configuration spaces. It's not easy to put in your brain. But we have some sense in which it's mathematically best. And the proof that it's mathematically best does not rely on the entries of alpha or beta being numbers. And this is the only truly mathematically sophisticated idea I have ever had about hockey. There's a joke about advanced stats. I have a totally useless PhD in mathematics. In terms of sophisticated mathematics, this is not the most sophisticated thing I've ever done, but it's by some distance the most sophisticated thing that I've ever done in hockey. Is that any inner product space for alpha and beta will do. Anything where you can take the things in alpha and beta and add them up, and then also find some way of saying, if I have this one and this one, I can multiply them together somehow and get a real number. Any inner product space will do the trick for that. And so, I'm not going to go through the gory details, but we're just going to take that as an idea. We're going to say, we don't have to think about measurements about players as being numbers. It could be anything that we can add together. So before, I said, what if we just had alpha as the list of combinations of the guys that we saw? What if we dream bigger than that? What if we imagined that we had an alpha for every single combination of players? Now, we sort of, those of you who have enjoyed my talks before will know that I enjoy this thought experiment of sort of taking away a whole hockey team of players into the Swiss Alps and then making them do experiments for you. And so what if we took 20 guys and made them play in every combination? Just played in little scrimmages against one another. And we just iterated through every possible combination of 5 players. One of the things that would do is that it would take our design matrix and it would make it really, really simple. We could take all of the combinations of k players at a time from the n players that we took to our chalet in the Swiss Alps. It's not just a ring, we have a chalet, I have a whole thing. And you could come up and then you could say, all right, this is how we're going to imagine that they combine together. We're going to imagine they combine together linearly. And so in particular, this means I know exactly what happens in the matrix X. I fix my enumeration of all of those combinations. And so if you're in the kth combination, sorry, if you're in the jth combination, the 456th combination, if a particular player is in the combination, then you get a 1 over k, 1/5, because you are 1/5 of the people on the ice. So either you're 1/5 of the people on the ice, if you're on the ice, or you're not on the ice and you're 0. So in particular, this means we know everything about this matrix X if we have all these observations. And then we could take that equation and we could actually solve it. This is not the normal way of doing things. The normal way of doing things is, at first we wanted to solve x beta equals alpha, and they're not equal. We could just take the difference between them, find out how big that is. You have to use a distance function that's suitable for the big configuration space that you're in. But whatever that is just here's some function defined on real Euclidean space of however many dimensions. What's the minimum? Hard to think about that function. You sort of pretend like it's a big bowl shape in your head, and you try to find the bottom. You have any number of clever algorithms to do that. The other thing you can do is you can take the direct solved equation, especially if you know alpha, and you can work out that product, x transpose times x. You want to invert that times x transpose times alpha. That's reasonably simple calculations. People have been making Fortran libraries to solve those problems since the beginning of computers. In fact, we invented computers to more efficiently implement those algorithms that we had. We invented Fortran to more efficiently describe them. Linear algebra is the birth of how we solved all of these problems. However, in our case, if we had all those measurements, we could do this by hand. And so that's what I'm going to do for you, kind of. So if this was a movie, this is where you would start to see the equations float across the faces, where you would see, and the terrible music would come in the background. In fact, I'm not going to walk you through all of this. You should consider yourself lucky. But if you're familiar with any kind of combinatorics, you'll actually find it reasonably straightforward. If you teach like a second-year combinatorics class, you could probably give this to your students if you wanted to. I don't do any of you teach a second-year combinatorics though. I have taught a second-year combinatorics. And so then you do this. That's me telling tales of myself. That's not a boast. And so then you do some more, and then it turns out I lied with the numbering. There's another one. Hey, look, it turns out to simple numbers. So go one more. It turns out, you do all that work, it turns out that the entry of beta corresponding to a player P is very easy to describe. The setup, the only letter you need to remember a lot about is K. We were assuming that there are n players that we were considering. We looked at all the combinations of those players, K at a time. And it turns out that if you have all of these measurements, and the intestinal fortitude to do a bunch of combinatorics, you can't imagine the irony for somebody like me who carefully avoided combinatorics throughout a lot of math degrees to do all this work. The average of all of the entries in alpha that contain that person, take that huge average of all those things and then multiply it by k, so 5 in this, if you're talking about hockey, and then subtract off k minus 1 of all the average of all the entries without that person. So in this case, if we're talking about hockey, you're talking about 5 and 5. It's just, what's that average multiplied by 5? What's that other average multiplied by 4? And subtract them. You'll notice in particular already from this, even before we do any actual calculations, we can start to see that if you are a particular player and your team performs in a particular way when you're on the ice, and then when you leave the ice and are replaced with somebody else, if your team performs in exactly the same way, then those two averages in this formula are going to be exactly the same, and the estimate of your ability is going to be 1 times whatever that average was, namely the way that your team performed both with and without you. Whatever that level was, you clearly match it, since when you come on or off the ice, nothing happens to the level. So, well, that's good. However, you'll notice this is ordinary least squares regression, which tends to be, those of you who may know technically, which tends to be a little bit aggressive in assigning credit and assigning blame. So instead, I decided to do ridge regression. And I'm going to spare you the combinatorics, but you can do the whole thing again. Only instead of doing standard regression, you do ridge regression. I'm going to wave my hand a little bit about ridge regression so that you understand what the point of it is. The point of it is to try to deal with multicollinearity and ill-fitting, the word's just gone in my head. When you have matrices which are badly behaved. That's a technical term. So what does that mean in this case? It means you have a way of getting a hold of trying to separate players who share a huge amount of ice time. I opened with the sedines for a reason, they're going to come back. So if you add in this parameter, the lambda as it's typically called, what you're doing is instead of minimizing the function that you're minimizing before, where you're saying I want the least squares deviation of these things to be as small as possible, you're saying, and also I don't want any of the estimates of any of the individual players to be too far from 0. I won't be dragged away from what actually happened too much. And when I say this requires standardization, you have to be really careful, because if you do it naively, you're going to drag all of your players towards 0 shots for and towards 0 shots against. And that's not what your standard basic expectation should be for a hockey player. Right? This has come up in several talks before. We have some understanding about all of the players who are appearing on the ice. We know, so like, if you see some new rookie goaltender who's getting a bunch of minutes, you shouldn't assume that he's going to let in 100% of the shots that he sees, right? He's only getting those minutes because somebody thought, I know, let's put in so-and-so. And they did not do so thinking that he was chopped liver. They did so thinking that he was the best choice that they had, and probably at least replacement level, if not league average. So so standardization here means just rewriting all of the data in terms of deviations from league average. So we're going to shrink all of our estimates towards league average, or rather let such a tendency take place in our regression. However, we need observations from all combinations of 5 players, and we don't have them. So I have a confession here. This is not the first time I presented this research. I spoke at at a hockey conference, or rather a multi-sport conference in Wisconsin, not too long ago, where I presented research that was substantially similar to this. There I had an ingenious mathematical trick to get a hold of what I wanted from the previous slides without having to actually take observations from all of the combinations. My ingenious mathematical trick was badly, badly broken. And in fact, all my research results, and they were trash. And so Chris Wong kindly pointed out to me exactly where I went wrong, which left me thinking to myself, well, if I really need observations for every combination, what if I just bake it? What if I just impute results for all of the combinations that I don't have results for by snatching nearby data? There's a joke of mine that everybody wants more data, but you can't make more data appear just by taking nearby numbers and sort of slapping a polo shirt on them that says data. You need data that comes from a particular. This is another pet peeve of mine is about sample size. When people say, oh, well, we'll always need more sample size. These people have more sample size because they played more minutes together than those people who played sample size. They don't have a larger sample size. Those people have a larger population size. If you want a larger sample, this is an aside. I'm not really getting bogged down. But the sample that you have, the population that you have is all of the games that are played. And if people didn't play together, then no. Like I said, I'm not getting bogged down in this. It's not the point. The point is, I am serene and calm. The point is, when observations aren't available for a set of 5 guys, that we want an observation for these 5 players to play together. We don't have it. What can we do? Well, we can look at, what if we had 4 of them at a time? And we just let the 5th person, who's not the person we want, just be any of them at all. So there's a whole bunch of different combinations. And so we drag in adjacent data. And when we have to, what if we also looked at possible subsets of 3? And what if we looked at possible subsets of 2? And now we can get coverage, imputed coverage. We are making up data from nearby data. We can get coverage for almost the entire spectrum that we need. And the spectrum that we don't have, we think is unimportant. So in this way, we're going to manufacture observations for every combination of players. So that's That's reasonably simple. There's my regression. I'm going to run it. However, that part only talks about teammates, and I promised you that I was going to try to isolate not just for teammates, but also for the score, and also for zones. And so for this, we're going to adjust each alpha value, each observation, no matter how we got it, whether we just read it off for these 5 guys or whether or not we imputed it from looking at nearby data. We're going to adjust for them for score and for zone individually. So first of all, score adjustment. So the very first thing I published in Hockey Analytics ever was about score adjustment. I found an excellent article of Veritelski's, and I couldn't understand it, and I really wanted to. And so in the end, I had to develop a whole new way to calculate what he was calculating because I didn't understand how he was calculating it. This is more my fault than his fault, but it's had a long thread of fertility, as you can see. In particular, this is what we observe over the last several years. When the home team is losing, they get more shots. That's what it says in the top left there. Those red things right here is more, blue is always less. When the home team is losing, they take more shots. And the bins there are, the middle bin is tied. The 2 to the left are losing by 1, losing by 2, and then losing by 3 or more. And similarly on the other side, when the home team is losing, they take more shots and they permit fewer. And the same thing, not quite as strong, the same thing happens on the other side. When the home team is winning, they take fewer shots and they allow more. Losing teams play better, but still usually lose. There's a fundamental truth to hockey. So these are not just pictures, though. I mean, they are pictures. They are just pictures. However, you can use these, you can work them into masks, where you can use to adjust individual observations. So if you have a particular set of 5 players, and they largely play when the team that they play for is losing, then you can work out how much do they play when it's tied. Take the weight of that. How much do they play when they're down by 1? When they're the home team, when they're the away team. You break it out into 2 pieces. You make a mask that accounts for what you would expect, how you would expect the score specifically to affect their play, and then you adjust the measurement that you've got to get a score-independent measurement. Similarly for zone, this is the most intuitive slide here. When you start in your own zone, you give up a lot of shots. And when you start in the other guy's zone, you get to take a lot of shots. When you start on the fly, then you get shot patterns which are very, very close to average. This is because most of the time, most shifts for most players are on the fly. This is why you should be extremely skeptical of anybody who quotes you a zone usage metric that adds up to 100% when you take only 2 of these things into account. The huge, huge bulk of hockey is played not in shifts that start in either the defensive or the offensive. Most shifts by most players start on the fly. Neutral zone shifts aren't especially common, and when you do see them, no one gets shots. Standing start, there's not a lot of people going everywhere. There's lots of time to stand up to get great defensive structure. Nobody gets shots. So if you agitate for a rule change that means more pucks getting dropped in the neutral zone, I will hate you. But it's the same thing you can do. You can say if somebody starts their shifts in these zones and in those zones and in these zones and those styles, you can just write down the pattern of ways that they start their shifts and adjust their results accordingly. So that's a lot of math. That's a lot of thinking. What's the plan so far? What have we actually done? So the key idea is we're going to take shot densities. Some of my friends will yell at me if I don't point out that, strictly speaking, the units of the things that we're talking about is shots per unit area per time. And so by rights, that should be called shot flux. That's what flux actually is. It's not just a buzzword for bad TV. I can't do it, so I'm just calling them densities. We have to understand that they're time and space densities. That takes a long time to say, so we just decided to invent flux, but I decided to buck this trend. That's what we're treating as first-class objects. We're going to adjust the observations that we see for the score that prevailed when the hockey was played, and also for the zone that it was played in. Before we do that, we're going to impute observations for all the combinations we didn't see, and then we're going to use ridge regression to isolate the individual performances from teammates. Let's see how we did. So how are we going to see how we did? So in this talk, we're going to look at 3 different ways. First of all, we're going to consolidate the impact. So for the purposes of verification, we're going to consolidate impact of these shot maps, these shot densities, into more convenient units, into numbers, so that we can deploy some more familiar tools. Once we have those numbers, we're going to measure correlations from season to season, and that's going to be our sort of most serious metric. If the performances that we see spring from individual abilities, like we hope that we've isolated, we expect that individual abilities change slowly, and so that performances will be repeated from year to year. That's what we expect. We're going to look at some interesting examples to try to get some insight about whether or not the technique works, about whether or not it's telling us something interesting and new about players. And we're also going to look at the tails of the distribution for this year purely for fun. Tails of distributions are, in some sense, I mean, they're real crowd pleaser stuff, and I cannot resist, and I'm sure you'll all enjoy them because we will laugh at some players. But the tails, I mean, there's some purest part of me rebels against it. The tails of the distributions are where the errors go to live. That's where that's what makes them the tails. And almost always the best work is never in isolating the best performances or the worst performances. This is where stats give the least insight. The most insight is gained from the distinguishing people who are close to the center. But we're still going to do it because it's still fun. So what do I say when I mean consolidate impact into convenient units? So for this is, and now, I don't know how long it took, but now we're finally defining the word that is the title of the talk. We're going to wait. Once we have these isolated maps, and of course we have them, I just haven't shown them to you. That's because I've decided to indulge in suspense. We're going to weight the isolated shot contributions according to league average shooting percentages from a given location. So if your shot map biases heavily towards the net front, your threat is going to be higher. And if your shot contribution biases heavily towards the points, like say you play for the Flyers, you're going to have considerably lower threat. And you might say, why am I using league average shooting percentages? And the point is that I'm carefully not trying, I'm deliberately not trying to include any shooting talent as such. I'm trying to include shot quality by looking at where shots are taken on the ice. But and I'm deliberately doing this because I want to start with something that's both simple and concrete and also symmetric for offense defense. If you wanted something more systematic, you would need to also include shooter talent, and then you would need to include goalie talent. I mean, this talk is not the culmination of my entire life's research. It is a single idea, and that idea is merely shots and their locations and their rates, without any goaltending. That's going to come back again. But this thing I like to call threat. So the units are goals per hour. Right? We're going to take a number of shots, a number of shots per hour, and we're going to multiply that by shooting percentage. Shooting percentage is goals per shot, so what we're going to get is goals per hour. The temptation to call it expected goals is very strong. Please do not do this. There's two reasons why you shouldn't do this. At least two reasons. One is that there are so many stats that are called expected goals that are philosophically different from what I'm trying to get a hold of. Two, one of the best arguments that goes on, as in the one that I enjoy the most, is what do we do about shooter and goalie talent? And I think that should be part of the expected goals discussion, and I don't want to enter that discussion. So I'm deliberately avoiding that name. But the units still are goals per hour. If you want like a kind of a thought experiment about what it is I'm talking about, you should imagine to yourself showing somebody a video of all of the hockey with all of the best bits removed. So just imagine that you show somebody an entire game from puck drop all the way until somebody takes a shot. And the instant their blade hits the puck, you cut and go to the next time that the puck is in open play again. You just don't show them the result of anything. But this thought experiment is really useful. Do this again and again and again. It's the most maddening sort of edging style way to watch hockey, where nothing is ever, like no goals are ever scored. They don't show you the score at the top. You don't know who wins. This is a terrible idea. This is Micah's idea to torture you. And so once you're careful about talking about what it is you're cutting out, then it becomes really obvious. It's very sad too for me personally because goalies play almost no role in they appear extremely rarely in such footage that that's the best bit of hockey. I'm literally taking all the best bits out. But what you're left with is, and hopefully, all of the things that I'm trying to measure with this isolated shot impact. So if you're throwing hits that generate puck battles, and then you or your team are winning those puck battles, that's going to show up in this. If you're stick checking well, that's going to show up. If you're being hit and coughing up the puck, if you have terrible zone exit, it's going to show up. This is in between that level of microstats and any kind of goal-based analysis, even though the units are goals. And so this is part of why I like threat. Nothing bad happens to you, but you are threatened many, many times. So this is the Sedines. Sorry, this is Daniel's Sedine. We're going to actually have Henrik too in a second. So on ice is just what happened as of. So I double-checked again all these things. I didn't update the slides because even though some more games have gone on, it looks exactly the same. So on ice is on the left is what actually happened with Daniel Sedin on the ice this year. So you see that healthy red zone right in the slot and in the net front. So the Canucks are getting lots of good quality looks while he's on the ice. 44 shots an hour, that's a little bit above average. 2.5 threat, that's the goals threatened per hour of 5-on-5 hockey. League average for that is about 2.2, so 0.3 extra goals. And then you run him through the regression. For the purposes of this talk, I used the top 20 skaters on every team. And so the top 20 skaters by ice time, by total ice time, for the Canucks gives you 98% of their season. So 98% of their 5-on-5 data is being used there. And you notice that the isolated thing looks very similar, except more pronounced. The shots from the left point, which we observe, are not isolated to Daniel. Instead, shots from the right point start to come out. Also, you notice that that blob in front of the net is not some accident that's assigned to other people. Credit for that is assigned to him. And also, his isolated impact contains a very pronounced tendency to shoot from the left-hand side of the ice. That's a team tendency to shoot from the left-hand side of the ice, not the right-hand side of the ice. Note the big blue areas at the top of the right face-off circle and down low in between the right face-off dot and the net. Very, very little. So even though the observed, you see those two things in the observed data as well, but it's much, much less. And so some of those things that we see in the on-ice data are traceable to him personally, and some of them are caused by other people with whom he's playing. And part of what makes it interesting, part of what makes this especially interesting, is that the Sedins this year are getting a great deal of generous usage. They play with one another. That's a great teammate boost to start with, because we know qualitatively, intuitively, that they're some of the best forwards in the team. They play very heavily in the offensive zone, this year more so than in previous years. And their score distribution is not actually particularly descriptive. But we see here that all of those things, that even after you isolate those things, we still kind of intuitively expect the Sedins to be well flattered by this, because on the one hand they play with one another, but after that they mostly play with weaker players. So their isolated impact should still be strong, because we intuitively expect, and it turns out we see in this case, that we expect that as a rule they'll be being dragged down by the players they play with, both defenders and other forwards, not vice versa. And so in this case, the teammate impact, which is hurting them, is considerably, well, not very much, is matched nicely by the zone impact, which is benefiting them. And so once you merge the two parts of context together, you can get an interesting picture of what's going on. Now let's look at his brother Henrik. On ice, it looks almost exactly the same. Big surprise, they play almost all their minutes together. However, they do get split up, and they get split up for particular reasons, and the fact that we are accounting for those reasons is what lets us get a handle on the difference between them. This is, so, I mean, I've made a lot of hay out of making a lot of graphs about making a lot about wowies, about with you or without you analysis. Here's a picture of the Canucks with Daniel, here's a picture of the Canucks without Daniel, here's the same thing for Henrik, the same thing without Henrik. And a legitimate criticism of that many people have made when trying to resolve the who's carrying who things is that the splits themselves contain data. They were put together for a reason. They were split up for a different reason. And so I've made, last year I talked at a different conference about isolating coaching usage for pressure, for when you're under defensive pressure or offensive pressure. And there it was extremely obvious that you could see particular pairs of players who were routinely played together, and that as soon as the stakes were strongly tilted towards we really need a goal or we really need to defend, all of a sudden they got split up and the new rearrangements came. So wowies, if I was running some sort of experiment in the Alps where I was rotating through every possible combination of players, I would do it in an unbiased way. But coaches who put players together and put them apart are doing it in an extremely biased way. In fact, those decisions, those are deliberate decisions with specific goals in mind and specific situations in mind. So getting back to Henrik, we notice that the general pattern for him is the same, the on-ice pattern. However, The isolated pattern does not show the same marked tendency to cause the Canucks to shoot from the left. That was something that we saw that was associated with Daniel, the left winger, who plays on that side. But Henrik himself shows only a much milder tendency towards making the Canucks shoot from the left. You do see that red blob down low on the red face-off, on the left face-off circle. And you see that that tendency to pass back to the right point is even more strongly associated with Henrik than it was with Daniel. So I deliberately set myself a hard example here because the Sedins are kind of like Scylla and Charybdis to ruin all of your data analysis. And in this case, I feel like I've done a decent job, even though the changes are not very dramatic. Most of the other players in the league show much larger changes from the on-ice observed to the isolated. I mean, here we go from 2.4 threat to 2.1 threat. That's a reasonably substantial drop. And so you see that Henrik is benefiting from playing with stronger line mates to a larger effect, to a larger extent than Daniel is in terms of offensive ability. So those are offensive results. Let's look at the same pair of players for defensive results. So here's Daniel defensively. Notice that there's an unpleasant red blob right in the high slot there, middle to high slot. Looking good in front of the net and generally looking good overall with lots of sort of largest blue areas. But if you weight by how often the goals actually go in at the league average rate, you see that that's pretty average. You know, there's lots to love there, and there's also lots to hate, and when you add it together, you get a very league average kind of performance. And then you wonder yourself, I wonder if there are any particular tendencies here that are associated to Daniel, and in this case, you see that what you see is basically what you get. You run it through the isolation process, and you get something that's very, very similar. Although it's not quite as big, in particular, that ability to clear the net appears to be traceable to Daniel himself, and so you see that in the threat numbers. The total shot numbers barely go down, 39 shots to 38. That's a very, very small difference. But the threat goes down considerably, 2.2 to 2.0. So you're getting 10-ish% reduction in the goals against you would expect. And then for Henrik, so Henrik, we saw that his offense was somewhat given to him by his line mates and his zone starts, but his defense, you notice, is the same way. Again, the on-ice is extremely similar, and now we notice that his isolated shots have the same pattern, but even more so, he's dropping also by about 0.2 in total threat. So it would be my delight if we could move the conversation past these players are sheltered by their line mates, those players are being buried defensively, these players are only deployed when their team is losing and goals are easy to come by. This guy's never asked to defend, into how much of those things happen. What happens when you balance them all together? What happens, what kind of total impact do you have? In fact, there's some beautiful future in which you could run, in fact, you could probably already do it now, that there's such a great difference between having an idea and having an idea that you know is good. I mean, if you were completely sure that what I was doing was excellent, I'm not completely sure. If you were totally sure, you could say, well, here we could make it counterfactual. This is what it would look like if we took this player and gave him these zone starts and this score deployment and these teammates. You just combine them all together, apply the masks in the other direction. Don't try to account for those things. Try to put them in. Say, this is what's going to happen. We'll get there. So I also want another example of somebody else entirely. This is Matthew Perreault. I have to be forcibly restrained from tweeting things about Matthew Perreault most of the time. He's having a tremendous offensive season. He's had a slightly wonky distribution of usages this year. He's been hurt in various places, and he played a totally different role before he was hurt, and then after he was hurt, he gets moved around the lineup a lot. He played extensively on the Jets' fourth line. He's also played on all three of their other lines. He's been moved around from line mate to line mate. He's had a really weird year. And so you might well wonder, especially for like a journeyman kind of within his own team, and also for that matter within the league, you might wonder how much of that is Matthew Perreault and how much of that is opportunism. And it turns out, at least offensively, it looks like a lot of that is Matthew Perreault. That's just offense. 2.7 threat, that's 0.5 better than league average. 2.9 isolated to him, that's quite a bit better. That's a big offensive boost. Let's see if he's giving up something in defense to get that. No. He's having a great year defensively, 1.8. And you notice that what shots that are gotten by people are not the Jets tend to be not in front of the net. And you isolate that impact to him. You see this pattern. This would be very difficult to get with just a plain Wowie analysis, although you can do that too. What you see is that every time he moves from a line to another line to another line to another line, it does better than it did before, even after you account for defensive usage, offensive usage in the score. Okay, so that was fun. Let's be slightly nerdier. Let's look at some correlations. So I graphed this just because I compulsively make graphs. The only thing to take away from that is the correlation itself, which is 0.5. This is just offensive threat. You see the average there around clustering around 2.2. There's a fair bit of range though. For that, this is from a handful of years. I'm going to give you some more details about the range in a second. Defensively, it's very similar. It looks a little bit different because there's one terrible outlier. You can see him up at the top there at around 2.4, 2.5 isolated threat in a previous year, and about 4.2, 4.3 isolated threat. This is defense. So this is somebody who used to allow a little bit more than league average, who is now allowing lots more than league average.
That's rude to say about Roman Polak.
It's not. Roman Polak doesn't look nearly as bad as some of his detractors might. He doesn't look great. But so anyone who has not actually seen me say the person's name on Twitter in the last few weeks, if anybody would care to take a guess at who that outlier is, it would amuse me. That's what this is about, amusing me. Anybody? No, that would be fun. I would have led with that. It is Seidenberg for the New York Islanders. He is having a horror year. The other thing I like here is looking at net measures. What if you take out, if you subtract the threat of the goal of the shots that are taken against you from the threat of the shots that are isolated to you? And here we also see again a similar kind of measure. You'll notice also that the skew, very, very hearteningly for the health of the league, the skew is pretty heavily positive. In fact, this is one thing I did not even try to account for, is to make a survivor bias analysis of this. You would expect that people who have really dreadful results here, so they would appear in the bottom left corner, you would expect that those players, so to appear in the bottom left corner here means you had a terrible year in all up, and then you had another terrible year all up. You would expect that there wouldn't be too many of those players, and in particular, there wouldn't be too many players who would play twice and then get another such year. You would hope for this whole thing to skew positively, and it does. You can see that even though I didn't center these axes, you can still see that above to the top right of 0, 0 is still much, much better inhabited than below that. So what are the autocorrelations and how do they compare to other other measures that we understand? So I did not include as much data as I would have liked. I looked at players who did not change teams, who were in the top 20 of their teams by total ice time in a given season for 2015, 16, 16, 17, and 17, 18. And this data, unlike some of the other data, is good up until like 2 days ago or something. So isolated threat, this thing that I've been telling you about is the thing at the bottom. Those are the same correlations repeated from those graphs from a second ago. The correlations for on-ice goals, just do you get scored on, do you score? Well, or rather, does your team get scored on, does your team score while you are on the ice? Because there's no individual scoring here at all. Is quite a bit worse. Goal measures are trash this way. On-ice unblocked shots, so this is just, if we just did the same process with no isolation, just looked at the numbers there, you get actually slightly better correlations, somewhat surprisingly, although actually those, they are slightly better, but the improvements there are not significant. On-ice shots, you start to see a little bit more, but defensively you don't see any big difference. So in terms of repeatability, you see something that's broadly in line with the various measures that we have at this point. And another thing which is very interesting to me, and this is a bit different from the other things we see, is that the correlation between your offensive threat in a given year and your defensive threat in a given year is basically 0, which corroborates something that a drum that I've been banging for many years now, which is that being good defensively and being good offensively don't have anything to do with one another, which does not mean that you can't be both. In fact, it precisely means that any combination is fine. You can be great at both, or bad at both, or good at one and not the other. There are players of every type in the league. And so I've already shown you some examples. But what we see is that the performances of offense and the performances of defense appear to be independent. So you might wonder, Micah, why did you come all the way to Vancouver to only show us 3 seasons of data? And the reason for that is that every data point takes weeks to get a hold of, and it costs me money to buy server time. I didn't put a lot of stress on it before, but when I said we are going to either find or manufacture data for every combination of 5 players taken from 20 at a time. So I chose 20 because it gives you a coverage of a total team size time that I feel is enough. 95 to 98% for most teams, sometimes 99% for some teams. If you know what 20 choose 5 in your head is, that's good for you. But it's a big number, and you need all these calculations. And each of the calculations, because of the whole design of what we're doing, every calculation is a calculation involving not numbers, but involving these maps. And each observation has to be adjusted, which involves a whole host of other maps. So I spent many years at a startup job, which I despised, trying to tell people to not implement exponential algorithms. And then I went into hockey where I implemented a factorial algorithm, which is the only thing in the world that works. In fact, I say that, that's not literally true. The only things that are actually worse than factorial algorithms are algorithms that are invented by people who are trying to answer the question, are there things worse than factorial algorithms? This one at least appears in nature, if you like, as natural as ice hockey is. So let's look at some outliers. This is sort of fun. A lot of the serious things are all gone. You can turn your brains off. The best defensive threat performances this year. There's a handful of surprises, in particular right at the very top. Matt Stajan's played almost exclusively on the Calgary Flames' 4th line. But a lot of these players, because this is isolated to defense, it contains no impact whatsoever on offense, a lot of these players have extremely ordinary offensive results. But Matt Stajan is having a tremendous year on the Flames' 4th line. Part of why he looks good by this measure is that he's been routinely saddled with players who are known to the public and also to my algorithm to be extremely bad. And so his on-ice results are not as good as this. But when you try and extract who is sinned against and who is sinning, you see that Stajan is the one who's keeping those lines afloat, not the one who is sinking them. Similarly, Charles Hudon is a staple in the bottom 6 in Montreal. He has an excellent threat against. Keep in mind the league average here is 2.2, so these deviations are quite strong. These are the top 10. You notice that the range goes pretty quickly. The difference is already 0.2 from 1st to 10th. And so we mostly see bottom 6 forwards with very clear defend-only instructions from their coaches appearing here. And a handful of stay-at-home defenders. Hanius is a great example. Colton Parayko, who's been given a more defensive role this year than last year. Greg Pattern, also more defensive. He's paired routinely with Hanius. Jordan Nolan in Buffalo. And also Matthew Perreault is there, because he turns up like a bad penny in everything you do. Those were the best defensive performances. Here are the best offensive performances, and these ones are actually weirder in some way. This is partly because we're so used to thinking of offense as points. And at no point was anything that happened after somebody shot a puck, at no point was a shooter-goalie interaction considered here. And so a lot of the suspects are the usual suspects. Sidney Crosby shows up at the top. That's a good feeling. Connor McDavid also shows up very, very high. After that, a lot of the players are players that you might not expect. Chris Letang, for instance, is having a horror year defensively because his goalies can't stop a shot. But offensively, he's still creating a tremendous amount. Timo Meier is very, very quiet. This is one of those things where you look at something. So I remember Timo Meier with great fondness. He used to play in Halifax, where I'm from. You should all move. And he was part of this incredible run of Duran, McKinnon, Meier, Ehlers, of just huge, huge talents come through. Heishier, come through Halifax recently. It's one of those things where you think, well, I haven't heard a great deal about him. His personal scoring is not so great this year, but his impact is incredible, and it comes out in lots of other ways other than this. Some of the others are a little bit more of a mistake. Jonas Donskoy, for instance, is playing extremely well, largely with Timo Meier, although not exclusively. Pierre-Luc Dubois is also sort of flying under the radar in Columbus a little bit, although I'm sure that the people in Columbus will tell me that their radars have been beeping Pierre-Luc Dubois for quite some time now. And then wingers like Tyler Toffoli are no big surprise. And then if you look at net threat, if you compare the defensive, many of those first players had dreadful offensive results. Many of those players on the second list had only so-so defensive results. Having dreadful defensive results doesn't give you a lot of ice time, and so you don't get to accumulate even if you're really good at something. In terms of overall threat, a lot of the names are the same. Pareko, Latang appear, Perot appears again. The Marchudano, Dark Horse, and Horus candidate in various years past. And again, a little bit surprisingly, Adam Lowry. And so this is net. So this is an extra, more than a goal per 60 minutes. So Lowry's been primarily in the Jets' bottom 6 for most of this year. And so when you have performances like that coming from your bottom 6, that's how you manage to outperform your previous win totals by staggering amounts. So the point of why I created this stat, of isolated threat, it seems to describe some repeatable aspects of defensive and offensive and all-around skater performance for players who do not change teams. I am eagerly straining the limits. I get nasty emails sometimes from my hosting provider saying, "What are you doing? Why don't you pay us more money for better computers?" It seems as though I feel reasonably happy that I've got a hold of some root of something really good. So what's going to go into future work? So for this work itself, for ways I could take what I've shown you, I could imagine I could have done it better. The qualitative competition, which I said I wanted to do and then I didn't do. You can ask me later about that if you like. That's a whole new can of wax. Where our intuitions and what we see are surprisingly at odds. Non-linear effects would be interesting. We used an entire linear assumption where we said, this is this person, this is this person. If we add them together, they produce their abilities plus their abilities. Maybe we could actually model non-linear effects where we could actually say, we're going to isolate these things into 3 sources. This is Daniel, this is Henrik, this is Daniel when played with Henrik. And so you'd isolate something, and then you, for instance, for those players in particular, you might see something like, he by himself is okay. He by himself is okay. The interaction between them is itself as good as a half-decent hockey player. And so when you put them together, you'll get that full impact. And when you separate them, you'll get a smaller impact. That's just a guess. The other thing I might do is the lambda value that I used for ridge regression is completely drawn out of a hat. I just made up something that was plausible and that had the kind of impact that I expected it to have. All of the tools for deciding what is a good value for that are incredibly ad hoc and also computable only in other set circumstances. The price you pay when you say, I'm not going to do this in the old setting with basic numbers, I'm going to do this with heat map, is just a whole host of technical tools desert you no longer have access to. You either can't efficiently compute them or sometimes you can't compute them at all. In terms of where I might go once I had this absolutely down to blown the saucer to where I wanted it to be, is then you could add in goalies and shooting talent, and you could presumably rework almost everything I said in a special team setting. You could do it all again for penalty killing, you could do it all again for power play or something. That's all I got. Thank you very much.
All right, just a quick reminder before you do questions. Please use the microphone when you ask your question. There's a button right below it. It allows everyone to hear you. It allows us to transcribe your question onto Twitter.
Do you think this could or would be worthwhile in prospect evaluation?
Yes. It's trickier. I think you have to. You would need to have the level of data that we have in the NHL, which is, I mean, it's such a shame. The NHL data is so bad, and yet it's so streets ahead of everything we have in every other league. So yes, if you had, I think if you don't have shot location data, I don't think there's a great deal of point to what I've done. I think if you do it all at the level of just numbers, I think it's much less impressive. So you would really need to make it worth the trouble, which is considerable, and the computational power, which is distressing. You would need to at least have shot location data. If you did, I don't see why you wouldn't do it, especially because then you might be able to get some sense of defensive impact from prospects, which right now we are still using scoring as a proxy for prospect evaluation. That's the people who actually know prospects. I don't know anything about prospects. In fact, just to tell a small story, somebody, was it you, Mike, said something about how you should take half of your staff and allocate it towards the draft. I've had 2 NHL team jobs now, and in both of the interviews for both of them, I said in extremely plain terms that I knew nothing about drafting and I knew nothing about prospects. And in both of those jobs, I got both of those jobs anyway, and in both of those jobs, I was repeatedly asked, are you sure you don't know anything about drafting? the need within teams for drafting prospect work is and people who know it, as I hasten to repeat, are not me. Know better than me, but we're still using things like scoring as proxy for defender quality for prospects. In part because we expect that the talent distribution is so much broader in prospects that you should be able to get defensive ability out of scoring when you have that breadth. I would still prefer to have more direct measurements of defensive ability, and I think that's part of what makes this good. The shooting talent ability, which I'm not talking about here, is obviously huge, and you would want a separate piece to and put them together. Sorry.
First, this is amazing.
Thank you.
Thank
Your mic's not on. There it is.
Thank you for the addressing the lambda thing. I was going to ask you about that, but also for the multipliers that you arrived at there, the 3.3.
Oh, those come out of the lambda.
Okay.
Once you set the lambda, then you just do the previous calculation and you just see what you get.
Yeah.
In fact, I meant to say before, and I should have said before, that there is a long chain of ideas which lead to this. And ridge regression specifically, Dr. Schucker's mentioned it, comes from his own work, but also from Brian McDonald's work at around the same time, about 5 or 6 years ago now. And there are hints there that there might be tools, Brian McDonald's work in particular, contains some possibilities for something that some ways that you might find suitable levels of lambda, even in the absence of most of the tools that you would use in a standard setting.
And then for the manufactured observations, did you consider maybe doing sort of like a k-nearest there, sort of that to fill in instead of doing the subsets?
No. I don't know. It might work. I'd have to think about it.
Yeah.
Part of what I liked about doing subsets is that it sort of effectively duplicated data for players who played a lot, because the base observations were all just rates, and so that cuts out a lot of the confidence you have in large samples.
Yeah.
And so I liked having that repetition, because players who played a lot would play in adjacent configurations a great deal. So I sort of enjoyed that idea that I would sort of bleed out the density of configuration space by doing it that way. But I don't know what it would look like if I did it with k-nearests, and I'd have to think about it. It might be a lot better. Yes?
I was curious, so your model effectively factors in both shooting rates and shot location, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious if you've done any investigation into how the results for this in terms of evaluating player talent, not shooting talent, but the talent described from those 2 factors, how different does the picture that emerges from that look like just a simple shooting rate, not factoring in location?
In terms of repeatability, there's no benefit that I can tell. I was pleased to do it with shot location as well because I felt like I got something out of insight. But in terms of statistical measures, the only one I've done was repeatability, and there was no profit there. I'm not sure. So part of why the other reason that I did it this way is that I was hoping that when I had a shooter analysis, it would start with already having established the location data as well, because I was imagining that I wanted to get a hold of is this person, does their shooting percentage, is it so much higher because they're taking shots in great locations, which is itself caused by another person, not by me. And so I felt if I didn't get a hold of it at this level, I wouldn't be able to use it at that second level. So I don't know, it really doesn't answer your question in a way, but the benefits that I anticipate, I still anticipate. I don't know if they're there yet. Yes, Mike.
Mike, a quick question, I hope.
We will decide.
If you took your alpha to be shot probabilities and just ran it through the ridge regression, how much different would it be than what you're doing?
So So if I just normalized everything, I think I don't know if there's any difference between dividing by 3,600 seconds or dividing by, in fact, it might be, in some sense, literally the same as what I'm doing.
I mean, I would expect it to be pretty close.
Yeah.
And it may be computationally faster.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, you might save me a bunch of money. Chris?
I'd just like to hear myself talk to that. Two questions. So one, the simple one is, have you looked at this sort of by team? So I saw like Winnipeg and like Calgary up there quite a bit. Did you sort of look at it, A, team by team for this year, and then team by team repeatability for previous seasons?
So the repeatabilities that I computed were all not for players in the season, but for players and a team in a season.
Got it. Okay.
And so which effectively means I only looked at players who did not change teams. If they did change teams, I still looked at them as long as they changed teams in the middle of the season, where I just treated them as two different players, one for one team and one for another team.
But not for like Calgary's collective team threat, like adding up individual threats together for the team level.
No, I didn't look at that.
Okay.
That would be fun.
And then the second question is, just in your observation, you might not have looked at this in the data, like what skill sets in particular, from a skater perspective, help, I guess, give people the best like individual threat scores? Is it like this overall speed or like hockey IQ? Like what do you see in the numbers that stands out?
Nothing, and that's not because, and I say that glibly, but I don't think it's because there's nothing there. I think it's because I am so incredibly weak at thinking in those terms that I haven't considered trying to isolate those things. I noticed a handful of things that could sort of lead you down a path like that. You know, like the defenders who have the best offensive impacts are the ones that are causing a great deal of shots to materialize from their offside close to the net. And so how they're doing that is not clear. Is it mostly seam passes to guys who are open? Is it mostly shooting for rebounds, which would naturally come out to the other side? Is it, you know, that kind of like coach level look at stuff is a terrible weakness of mine. But if you started thinking along those lines, and you know there are a couple little threads there that you could pick up. There were quite a few offside correlations like that, where we would see players that play on one side showing isolated impact on their other side. And that also gets into competition too. Are there some players who are causing shots to go to the other side because they're being locked down on their preferred side? Like, are there guys who are, like Carlson, for instance, shows a proliferation of shots on the side of the ice that he's not against, and which I suspect is because guys aren't targeting Carlson, they're going to target whoever he plays with. And on Ottawa, that's a strategy for success. So there are ways that you could get to an answer to your question, but I don't have the intelligence to get there. Maybe I'll give the data to you and you'll do it.
Yeah, no, it's a common concept in the NFL with shutdown corner, where it's basically like that person will have like no defensive impact, no interceptions or deflections because the quarterback uses it all that way. So yeah, that could be the case.
I expect that you'll see some weirdnesses that might be explained if you thought in those terms as well. And that kind of counterfactual data, especially when it comes to competition, is going to be really tough. Like, you know, he doesn't appear to show any ability to defend in this way, and is that because nobody tests it?
Your shot chart is basically Newell Brown's power play.
Basically what?
Newell Brown's power play white corner.
Very good. Who's that?
He's the assistant coach that runs the power play for the Canucks.
Very good. Our man, I assume. So yes?
Yeah, there's a skill distribution that varies because of the division strengths. Does that factor into the evaluation of the players?
So quality of competition that you allude to has sort of two levels. There's a micro level, where I'm playing against somebody who's really good right now, and next shift maybe I'll be playing against somebody who's really not good. And then there's also the macro level that you talk about, where some players consistently play against certain teams who are consistently weaker or consistently stronger than others. And so the short answer is no, I didn't take that into account. Especially because the division strengths tend to shift from year to year, that I took that as a possibility that maybe I might get away with that. It's definitely, there's a weasel answer if you ever want one. I also don't quite know how I would do it, but I'm not averse to doing it.
Do you feel it's a big enough of an impact anyway, or is it just something that's going to be negligible?
I expect, so my general opinion is that if you think something is negligible, you have to treat it like it might be a very big deal, and then you measure how much of a big deal it really was. Sort of give it as much room as it could possibly have, and then you see, oh, actually, it's only down here. You know, and then you say it's negligible. So I don't say I think it is negligible. Although I do expect that. That's not why I made the decisions I made in this talk. That was for expediency. In fact, quality of competition is a pain, especially at the micro level, which is not quite enough.
Yeah. What you provide is a descriptive measurement. You don't think there is any kind of predictive ability?
I expect there is a lot.
Did you run any kind of prediction or test?
Not yet. So this research is theoretically is about 2 years in the making. I've sort of essentially known what I want to say about it for about 3 or 4 months now. And I've been redlining all of the hardware to which I have access to generate the data that I showed you. I don't think I've hidden the fact that I'm extremely pleased with this myself. And I'm glad that nobody booed me because I was going to do a lot of stuff with this anyway. And so this summer in particular, I have great plans. You may or may not know I make a new predictive model every year. And this year's one is going to be based very heavily on using these isolated skater characteristics together with a shooter model and a goalie model to try to make a predictive model. And if it's bad, then I guess we'll find out in the summer. But even though it's conceived as descriptive, if it's doing the job that I think it is of capturing the part of individual abilities that lead to repeatable performances, if it's doing what I think it's doing, it should behave very well for a predictive model. In fact, it should behave a little bit better because I might be able to also guess at who is going to play with who, which is something that I've never tried to model in the past.
Well, that's what you think.
That's
the coach might think otherwise.
Yeah, right. And so
biases.
Those parts of hockey modeling where you're trying to get inside the heads of, I mean, I'm having trouble with it right now with the deadline analysis. You know, all these players just change teams. How much are they going to play? You know, and with whom is very tricky. So, yeah, I anticipate it being very predictive though. But no, that's just my hope. I don't know.
Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, there it is. So you mentioned that you had a bunch of assumptions, or not a bunch, but a couple of assumptions throughout your analysis.
Sorry, that's my phone. Could somebody turn it off? It's just an alarm telling me to go clean up my kitchen. I have domestic duties at this time of the day.
I was just wondering, is there like one that you think is like the most susceptible, or the one that you think that could affect your results the most, whatever assumptions that you made?
By far, the most important one, I think, of all the various assumptions that I made is about micro-quality of competition. In fact, I said a second ago that it's a pain. I have a couple slides here about exactly how it's a pain, but maybe I'll show you in that context. Someone over there suggested something about macro competition, which I think is also important, but I think comes in after micro. And in particular, if I had micro competition down, I feel like I would be in a great place to address the macro competition. And there's also a handful of things like rest, which I didn't include. You know, maybe some players happen to play largely when rested, especially with goalies. I mean, I didn't touch goalies here, but like that would play in. So give me one more slide. So this is a little bit harder to read, but this is a whole pile of heat maps where I tried to attack quality of competition with using average skater time as a proxy. So this is where you trust. So for zones, it's reasonably easy. You know, you just look at where the people are on the ice, and that's the zone. Whereas for competition, it's not so bad. It's not so easy. Nailing it down by player to player to player is computationally completely intractable. So if you try to bin it in terms of some rough estimate of ice time strength, you at least get that person's coach's opinion about how good he is, the people who play. So the axes here, I'm going to explain it because the letters are really small. On the left is playing against defenders who don't play very many minutes, so against third pairing. If you go to the right, you're playing against defenders who play lots of minutes. At the bottom, you're playing against forwards who hardly play any minutes. And if you go up to the top, you're playing against forwards who play lots of minutes. And the naive, totally plain approach that we took for the other things doesn't work anymore. If you play against forwards who play piles and piles of minutes, you surrender way less shots, fewer shots, than if you play against forwards who hardly play any minutes at all. That's extremely counterintuitive. All of those other things, the score ones are just, I just write it down. This is the score, that's what you get. This is the zone, I wrote it down, that's what you get. And they all were very intuitive. Well, intuitive score effects are weird, but we're used to it. That counts as intuitive. Whereas when you play with, especially for defense, the forwards you play against seem to have an inverse relationship to the shots you concede that you would expect. Why that is, I don't know. If I knew, I would have explained it carefully in the main body of the talk. My best guess is that it's badly confounded with some of those other things. That when you're playing against fourth liners, you're playing in your own zone, and that's overwhelming and that zone. Confounding can strike at any time. And I think that's what's happening there. And when you're playing against really good forwards, you're probably in their zone. And give me one more slide too, please. So that's defense. On offense, there's almost no correlation at all. It seems to make no, which is in its own way. I mean, the first way is fine. You think, it's confounded with this other thing. I'll just take that out and then it'll be nice. Whereas this thing just looks bizarre. It doesn't appear in terms of the shots that you get. The competition you play against doesn't, on its face, affect anything. It's a complete crapshoot. Whoever you play against is completely irrelevant. So that's really weird. And so if I had some sort of, and this is part of why I say, when people say, oh, well, so-and-so plays against great competition and he has great results, I think, well, are you really sure that he plays against such great competition? Especially because if you measure it in any other way, you might beg the question. So quality of competition is not just difficult, it's a real mare's nest. But there's this is the part of the map that says here be dragons, and there's something weird going on there. And once I tame it, then I think the weaknesses will be really down to a dull roar. So that's a long answer to a very simple question.
Sorry, I'm going to cut off the question just because to keep the event on time.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you very much, Micah. So I think some of you are going to be heading out here shortly. I know not everyone's staying around for the tutorial, so I'm just going to give a couple admin points for those who are leaving. Tonight we do have a social. It's at Central City Pub.